Clustery Podcast. I'm here with Nishay Devino.
How do you?
Brian Pace.
Hey.
Brian Normand.
Hello.
And I'm Dave Nichols. So part of the reason we do the intro is so that people can hear folks' voices, but I see that we've eschewed that on this episode. So you're just gonna have to guess on those associations, with the exception of Nishay, perhaps.
Well, there's two Brians, and there's one Nishay, and there's one David. So that was
Pace. And then Normie, you want to give us a slight audio clip so we can hear who you are?
I don't get it.
Because
you just introduced us.
Yeah, but everyone gave such short intros.
For the
this is
audience.
the shortness of the. Okay.
Yeah. Well, whatever. Fuck it.
We're making.
So yeah, we're doing a podcast.
In theory,
I think the podcast today actually stemmed from something that Brian sent to our Signal chat.
Yeah, but before we get into that, because we tend to, we try to do mailbag. We don't do as good a job of mailbag as we probably should, but we got a really nice message in response to announcing that Symposia is now a 501c3 nonprofit. So the message we just got was, congratulations. As someone who wrote some minor stuff for Symposia in its early days, it's been tremendously satisfying to see it grow into a fearless journalistic enterprise and a strong, inclusive community platform. This is well earned and deserved. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
We really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
And
so with that
try and live
said,
up to it.
Yeah.
Let's see how we can do. Normie had sent a little message to the group, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, something like that?
Yeah, I think it was last week.
Yeah.
So yeah, why don't you tell us what was going on and why we're here?
Well, a couple months ago, Nishay, she made the YouTube video that we published, Rebel Wisdom and the Psychedelic IDW. And in that video, she included clips from Anand Giridharadas and his book Winners Take. He's the author of Winners Take All: The Elite Charade of Changing the World. And I actually didn't know about him really before that. His name had popped up in a Democracy Now! Interview that Amy Goodman did with him. But I ended up picking up the book, and then one of the chapters, chapter 4, just like in particular resonated with me, and just the types of, the discourse and the types of characters that we see in psychedelic spaces. Chapter 4 is called The Critic and the Thought Leader. And in that chapter, he basically it just really spoke to me in kind of the environment that that this space feels like to me. So yeah, I shot a message to the group and just said, guys, read this chapter. Let's talk about this, because I think it's particularly relevant to what's going on, and I think kind of shining light on some of the issues that he brings up or would be of interest to our audience and in the community.
Hey guys, Editor Normie from the future here. I just wanted to take a moment and give a concise rundown, because some of this got buried later in the podcast. This episode explores the rise of self-styled, air quotes, thought leaders within the psychedelic community. Although people have been in the conference circuit for years, the recent explosion of capital investments means that there's an unprecedented potential for money, celebrity, and status in the space. Although these psychedelic thought leaders offer up their ideas as solutions to the world's problems, we take a look at how the thought leader cozies up to power under capitalism in a way that perpetuates the status quo. The thought leader proposes quick fixes that are palatable to the people who are in positions of power, who then seek to privatize those, air quotes, solutions while enriching themselves along the way. And while they talk about leading the way to meaningful change, they're really just focusing on the symptoms and getting paid while they're doing that. Corporate consulting firms like McKinsey & Company typify this dynamic as they propose solutions that do a little more than enrich themselves and their corporate paymasters.
I remember you shot over some excerpts, and my jaw kind of dropped, just, whoa, he might as well be describing the, psychedelic intellectual community, media community, even though he wasn't. It so perfectly described the dynamics, some of the dynamics we were witnessing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the little excerpts that I had sent over, it's by Andrew Zali. I think I'm pronouncing that. But Anand, he writes, an essay wrote to promote his book on resilience, argued that the world should focus less on rooting out its biggest problems, including poverty and climate change, and more on living with them. Zali believed that the desire to solve underlying problems is an alluring and moral vision, but ultimately wrong. The problems were perhaps here to stay, and it was more important, he argued, to teach people to cope. You can talk about our common problems, but don't be political, don't focus on root causes, don't go after boogeymen, don't try to change fundamental things. Give hope, roll with the waves. That is the market world way. And Anand, he throughout the book, he describes kind of the elites as market world.
Well, market world also, it talks to that sort of neoliberal sense of everything being handled best through markets, right? So market world is the notion that the entire world is most effectively or even efficiently governed through market demands and the free market and the notion
that super common assumption. I mean, like it's almost like a tell that you have taken economics 101, which, by the way, some studies have shown is something that's likely to make you more selfish. But in any case, that's an aside. I think we should say who Anand Giridharadas is. He was a writer for New York Times. He's written several books.
Columnist, yeah.
He's a columnist, but he was also somebody who has, real chops to talk about the global elite. Like, he was born into it, and he was a consultant for McKinsey.
A lot of people know about
group.
McKinsey recently because of Pete Buttigieg. He used to
Buttigieg.
But yeah, there's a lot of controversy because like McKinsey has their fingers in like all kinds of sketchy pots in terms of like, I think with Pete specifically, Mayor Pete, there was that incident with like bread price fixing
bread prices. Yeah.
Yeah. In Canada. And like, the company McKinsey specifically helps to make companies more efficient and optimized, but it's often at the expense of communities and environment and other kind of externalities.
Yeah.
Well, and internalities, right? Like when you talk about mass employee layoffs in order to improve profitability, because hey, you don't have to pay them salaries or bonuses or the rest of it, or
jacking
you can outsource or
drug prices. I mean, they're still up to a lot. Like so,
and it's worth. It just as a real quick aside, George Goldsmith of Compass Pathways, before he started Tapestry Networks, his prior company, which we've discussed before, he came up through McKinsey. And I think there was an acquisition of a company or a little working group that he'd put together called something like Tomorrow Labs. But, we see the people who have familiarity in this sort of market world ideology, using shared concepts and terms and accepting a bunch of things as true that actually sort of all demand examination and interrogation as to the values and assumptions that kind of underlie them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, the background of this author is, it's important because he's critiquing his own cohort, really,
and himself at the end. He gives some acknowledgement.
Yeah, and I believe his father was a former director of McKinsey, so it runs pretty deep. And I mean, look, a quick rundown of McKinsey, Enron, ICE. Purdue Pharma, the financial collapse, like they have their fingers in a lot of the bad things that have happened. And it's from that positionality that Anand is is basing his critique. He's saying these individuals are often using the rhetoric of changing the world, but they're the ones causing many of the problems in the world.
Yeah,
And
a
they
bunch
use
of
this
the
specific
psychedelic. Sorry, go ahead and Shay.
Well, they use what he calls like the protocols, which is this very atomizing, ruthless, optimizing methodology that seeks to kind of swoop in to an unfamiliar environment or context and just be able to very quickly notice where you can trim the fat and make a little extra money and make things, scale bigger and faster. And Anand's argument, and one of his main arguments in the book, is that is one methodology, but that doesn't necessarily follow that that's the best methodology for all kinds of problems. But like when you're what's that saying, when you have a hammer everything looks like a nail?
Yeah,
like it's that. So there's this sort of like hegemonic myth about like this in-group thinking that this one approach to doing things, because they've all been trained and they've seen successes with it, necessarily applies to all these other situations. And he's kind of emphasizing that really edges out all these other alternative ways of approaching problems that are more human-centric, community-centric, and don't have all of the baggage of causing all these problems internationally.
Yeah, the only point I was going to make is that I know in a handful of psychedelic companies, nonprofits now, we're seeing a handful of like McKinseyites in there. I know that the current MAPS directive strategy is from McKinsey. Just from his bio on the MAPS page says he then joined McKinsey & Co. in Milan, Italy, where he worked as a management consultant advising multinational financial institutions.
Incredible.
So we're starting to see them in the space now, a variety of these companies.
Totally. And I just wanted to call to attention a couple of the clips Normie sent us initially, just because I think they go to some of the framing and the recognition that we saw for the relevance of this discussion within psychedelia. Some of the excerpts, one of them was, public intellectuals argue with each other in the pages of books and magazines. Thought leaders give TED Talks that leave little space for criticism or rebuttal and emphasize hopeful solutions over systemic change. Public intellectuals pose a genuine threat to winners. Thought leaders promote the winners' values, talking up disruption, self-empowerment, and entrepreneurial ability. Now, not only do we see a huge influx of coaches and would-be psychedelic thought leaders taking exactly that approach, but also there's this dichotomy, let's say, between zooming in and zooming out. And when there's another section that Normie sent where he says, this is Anand saying, in our own time, the thought leaders have been deployed to help us see problems in a inserting here, non-systemic way. They, the thought leaders, are taking on issues that can easily be regarded as political and systematic: injustice, layoffs, unaccountable leadership, inequality, the abdication of community, the engineered precariousness of ever more human lives, but using the power of their thoughts to cause us to zoom in and think smaller. The feminists wanted us to look at a vagina and zoom out to see Congress. The thought leaders want us to look at a laid-off employee and zoom in to see the beauty of his feeling his vulnerability, because at least he is alive. They want us to focus on his vulnerability, not his wage.
Yeah.
And just when you say winners, I just want to stress that he's talking about winners under capitalism. So the people who have like achieved, the billionaires, the plutocrats, as he calls them, those are the winners. And the idea is that now we have what he calls this like kind of intellectual conference circuit ranging from Davos to Burning Man, where you have all of these billionaire plutocrats mixing with the new thought leaders who are, invited to the parties and flown around and made to feel special. And that the types of people that those plutocrats want around are the people that make them feel good about, they are the ones that can actually change the world. They have the power to do it, and not questioning any of their complicity in the actual problems of the world. So you end up with this kind of groupthink mentality around all of this money, and that those voices are lifted up that most support ultimately the status quo, even though they're saying this is in everyone's best interest.
And this is that's some of that trickle down consciousness that you, Nishay, spoke to in your video dealing with the psychedelic arm of the intellectual dark web, and Jamie Wheel, Lucian Tarnowski. We discussed that in a previous episode, and this also gets into some of the issues we talked about around manufacturing authority.
And contextualize a little bit with, the central thesis of it's not the central thesis, but one of the chapters in the book focuses on the idea of like win-win, being the win-win solutions being sort of hegemonic in Silicon Valley. Like if you are trying to do social justice, if you're trying to, focus on harms, you're doing things that are not welcome, And when we were talking about thought leader, he broke things down into 3 steps of being a thought leader, how to be a thought leader in 3 easy steps. Find a problem, focus on the victim, don't focus on the perpetrator, and personalize the political, like what you were saying earlier about zooming in rather than looking at systemic stuff, and then being constructively actionable, like some easy thing to remember.
But it's worth pointing out as an aside, or as a component of that being constructively actionable is not the same as being effective. Yeah. Right. So I
figured you might have something to say about that. I said I figured you might have something to say about that.
Well, it just seems interesting what people consider to be constructive, right? And what people consider the end goals to be. One of the examples that gets brought up, and sorry, I'm blanking on the name, but there's an app that gets used by, it's proposed for gig work employees, right? And this app, when you buy in, there we go. When you buy into it, right, it makes it so that if you earn wages that are sort of all over the place week to week, it flattens it. So rather than earning $300 one week and $800 another, maybe you earn an even $500 every week. And of course, even takes a cut of your paycheck in order to provide this service. It doesn't go anywhere near addressing the precariousness of the gig economy. It certainly doesn't do anything to even begin to question why companies are offloading all of the standard risk of business onto gig employees. It doesn't address the way that the system has been constructed so that companies can continue and increasingly make obscene profits as workers are leveraged with more and more and more risk. And so again, it's like you've done something, but what has been done in the case of Even and so many of these other so-called win-win solutions is not to actually address the problem. It's to sort of distract from the problem, say, hey, look, we're doing something. And
extract from the problem?
I think so. Yeah. Well, that's just it, right? This notion of doing well through doing good. Mm-hmm. And the notion that, you should be able to profit while you address these problems. To my mind, so many of these examples fundamentally fail to address and even inquire into some of the basic structural relationships within capitalism, right? The presumption that you can profit while helping your employees totally misses the fact that profit in the first place is secured through expropriating, a so-called surplus of your employees' labor and the value produced.
Just to give some an example for the risk in this context, he specifically mentions like someone who's working at a restaurant, for example, and where, business is low. And so the worker gets sent home. So because the restaurateur or whatever doesn't want to have to pay for that person to be around, until business picks up again. So it's like, why is all of that variability and uncertainty being put on the bottom level worker? Because you can address things like, employment laws, like the reasons we have the 40-hour, week standard and the weekend are because people organized to, have labor rights, and that it's possible to do that here rather than having a Band-Aid where, because someone like, who's barely scraping by, that $200, whatever you're paying even, is actually significant money. Like that's like something, that's some weeks of groceries, you know,
Totally.
that they are now just paying, you know, to the venture capital backed, you know, app. And so the question is like, why is this considered progress?
Well, and also just to be clear, you know, when you say organized, it can sound very orderly. Like people gave their lives, right, in the labor
They
struggle.
did.
Like
They were
people,
machine gunned to death in some
Guys, this
cases.
sounds very win-losey to me.
Sounds pretty win-losey.
Yeah.
Well, you know, tell those little children who were putting their hands in the thresher, and like, you know, tell the people who again were maimed and brutalized and killed.
Who still are. I mean, look, the Bangladeshi factories like
Yep.
collapsed earlier this year. Like you know, go back in time in labor law and then just go someplace else, and that's the Nike model. It's
Totally.
geography,
Well, so that's just
space
it,
or
right?
time.
The notion that you know, there's anything even resembling, let's say, an even playing field from which we're all voluntarily entering into these relationships and therefore can all win together as a team. Again, it's making fundamentally incorrect claims and assumptions about capitalism, which again, just to bring it back to Nishé's prior video, I think this notion of a trickle down consciousness, or a, you know, let the folks who are already benefiting obscenely from this arrangement sort of structure things in such a way that will supposedly benefit us all. We've already got more than enough real world examples that it doesn't work like that, because they have disproportionate access to the levers of power. And when you look at the system we're in, when you see companies advocating against taxation, against worker rights, looking at what just happened in California with, I don't remember what the measure is, but the Uber and Lyft, the gig work law that was just passed, right? Like these are things that these corporations and plutocrats have already given us plenty of evidence that they're not acting in the interest of workers. Why should we expect some sort of benevolence or philanthropy on the back end when we don't see it on the front end?
I mean, I think it speaks to a certain level of hopelessness, to be honest. And I think that was a subtext of Anand's Winners Take All, is that that these thought leaders have supplanted a public intellectual who, you know, whose foe was power, to critique power, to throw rocks, to not be beholden to, you know, state or private institutions, but instead to, you know, state problems as they are seen, to be a critic. That this role has been supplanted by a thought leader. You know, you're more likely to see somebody like, okay, are you going to see Noam Chomsky on Oprah? No, because he doesn't have something, that the one thing, and then the best-selling book, even though he's probably the most accomplished or one of the most accomplished public intellectuals of a generation. And you know, there's the hopelessness of the thought leader is that, you know, well, we can just do this one thing. We can get this idea out that will make somebody's life a little bit better. But we're going to do it without challenging
you mean their own
the sensibilities. Sure. Yes, that's win-win. But do it without challenging the sensibilities of capital. Let's get paid while we're doing it.
And there are all these cheerleaders right now who are basically, you know, seeing all of this venture capital, et cetera, pour into the psychedelic space and saying, like, you know, trying to angle themselves as thought leaders to say, like, oh, look at this, you know, capitalism plus conscious capitalism plus psychedelics can save the world. And then people like us who are trying to call attention to those very tensions within capitalism and the fact that, you know, extensive evidence shows that we can't just trust plutocrats to be our representatives and have our best interests at heart. We end up being cast as these, you know, malcontents, jealous types who just like weren't cool enough to get invited to the party, you know, but really it's just they're playing into these dynamics of simping for capital.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I would say that the uniqueness of the critique and perspective that we present here and on the website, I think it's a testament to the fact that few want to, you know, criticize the next bubble. Those who are entrenched, who've been here for a while, are waiting to get a consulting gig, and those who are new, have no interest in criticizing the gravy train.
Well, and there's two really interesting components to that, right? Like the fact that people are acting in these kind of self-interested ways, out of some desire perhaps to be included in the better party that perhaps they'd like to see thrown. But we've seen in some recent panels and videos, we've seen folks who've been in psychedelia for some degree of time making open appeals towards being recognized as thought leaders, and in fact in at least one case, right, sort of articulating some degree of upset that they were not being recognized by the new thought leaders as the thought leaders that were already here, and even asked the question explicitly, like, are we upset because, like, is the reason that we're frustrated by these new people coming into the field because, like, we're already here and it's some sort of territorialism? And for me, that it underscored the sort of difference in approach between the critic and the thought leader, where I can say I'm frustrated and upset with the capitalists crowding into the space precisely because of the corrosive effects it's had, and that we've discussed frequently on the science, on the community, on our communities, on the cultures. We've charted and demonstrated how these things have affected the community for the worse. But this
also
notion that
anticipated, I just want to say, based on knowing the history of all this stuff and being able to say, like, before it actually played out, this is likely to happen, being told you were a malcontent and then seeing it play out after that happened.
Right. And to now have the folks who were in some cases insistent that these predictions or, mappings made us malcontents, or that there was a need to sort of keep that quiet. The fact that there's now protestations that the new thought leaders are not recognizing them as the pre-existing thought leaders, and questions around territoriality, again, that gives a very clear sort of sense of the difference in critiques and why, what people are angling for, sort of personal clout versus more a broader liberatory politics, I would suggest. And we've also seen, one of the things that I find frustrating with some of these figures is the lack of content, right? We have this sort of ongoing, I don't know, empty rhetoric. And it's not even empty rhetoric in the sense of like words with no actions. In a lot of cases, it seems to be sort of cliff notes of a cliff notes of some sort of generalized critique that's come from somewhere else.
It's like read a Hopkins paper, get a little bit there, take a little bit from some fucking dump pile in Silicon Valley, take a little bit of Tim Ferriss, mix that into like a little just fucking cheesy soundbite, and then
the default mode network with some microdoses.
Go on LinkedIn, say that you're a visionary in the psychedelic space. Follow Tim Ferriss's four points to become an expert overnight, and then fucking bam, like get a couple people, pay you $50, $100. Now you're like this coach type thing, and then some cheesy ass new psychedelic company puts you on their fucking website, and now you're like some expert, and then you just roll from there,
or take a page out of Paul Austin's playbook, right? And have a business
described.
There's another page too, right? Have a business acquaintance call you up while you're talking with a reporter, and set it up as though you have a rollicking clientele that's calling you for.
Dave.
Huh?
Did that happen with the BBC, Dave?
It did happen with the BBC.
You reported on that. But yeah, it's just like, and then ultimately get your TED Talk. And then once you get your TED Talk, now you get the fucking cred. And then you can, leverage that however you want. And these things that I think a lot of people just, I don't know, maybe I'm being, I think these things are like intuitive though. Like these speakers, these thought leaders and what thought leaders, I can't even say the phrase like seriously. They just, it's just so damn cheesy, and the fact that people aren't like seeing through that, it's a shtick, one of the things that he writes about in the book is just on how ripe that field is for charlatans to move in. And psychedelic world has been,
it's the home court. It's the home court advantage.
And mix that to the psychedelic field, which has been, charlatan central for a long time. You get, like, moving forward, there's just going to be a whole crop of these, like, psychedelic thought leaders moving forward.
Rarefied sewage.
Yeah.
Well,
we're going to see a lot more, I think.
The actual, like, public intellectuals who are trained in critical thinking are the ones who are most, have the most background in being able to call out charlatans, for what they are. And so it's convenient to be edging out those public intellectuals by saying, oh, they don't like, they're not as cool as us and they wish they were. Like, we even had John Mackey, who is the CEO of Whole Foods, really recently coming on Joe Rogan, saying explicitly, intellectuals have always been the enemy of business and capitalism generally. They don't have the same social status that the entrepreneurs have. Underlying it is a resentment and envy of a society that doesn't judge them to be as important as they judge themselves. Like, that's how it's cast, and amongst this group for whom grift is a fine wine, they buy into this logic. It makes sense amongst themselves. They're in this kind of, like, closed circuit. But meanwhile, it helps to not just buy into this narrative and see that it's coming from a motivation of self-preservation on their parts, for their own power, for their own narcissistic, in this case, like, impulses.
Is conscious
I think you've got something there, though. Go on, Brian.
I was just gonna say, every day it changes. It's like on Mondays it's conscious capitalism, on Tuesdays it's constructive capitalism,
right.
On Wednesdays it's compassionate capitalism. So I'm not sure what the current accepted term is. Do you guys know?
Well, I heard it was triple bottom line, and then it was win-win-win, and then it was social entrepreneurship.
Corporate social responsibility.
There we go. Yeah.
And all nested within the infinite game.
The infinite game. Yeah. I wanted to bounce off Nishay calling grift a fine wine. Because hustlers recognize hustlers. And, like, if we're going to, go further with Rogan's quote, like, where does social status come from in an intensely hierarchical world where billionaires call the shots? Well, it comes from being recognized by senpai, by freaking Elon Musk, or finding some patron, right, who will shower you with cash and plaster your face everywhere. And suddenly, oh shit, your social status has risen because you've got some new kicks and you're fucking everywhere.
Elon Musk is into DMT,
it's not like a, well, I'm just saying it's not like a magic, like, recipe. This is how things function. There's all kinds of manufactured superstars all over the place.
But there's also a messianic sort of superstructure to all of this within psychedelics, where, like, a lot of people feel like this, psychedelics found them at this time to specifically aid with this transformation. And so the fact that they're networking now with all these billionaires is just part of the plan, and so there's this sort of, like, feedback loop where it becomes self-evidently confirming, it's like, oh, well, I made this connect with Elon Musk and now we're romping around Burning Man because I am leading this ascent into the new world. And so it's self-justifying for a certain clique of people within that community.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think in addition to the self-justification, to sort of build off both Nishay and Pace's comments on the Mackey bit, right? This notion of critics being having resentment and envy of a society that doesn't judge them to be as important as they judge themselves. Looking earlier at the people who were saying, hey, the new thought leaders aren't coming to the old thought leaders, right? Mackey and these, thought leaders are the people who are actually playing that game of clout. but then they sort of offload it and say, oh, well, it's the people who are not playing that game. It's the people who are critical of power. It's the people who are pointing out that you can't be both cozy with power and critical of it in an effective way, that they're just upset that they're not part and parcel of the better party that we're throwing. And I think it's worth pointing out when we talk about people who keep advocating to throw better parties around psychedelia, and in the context of Pace's comments just now about how does clout become a thing? How does reputation, how does social status become a thing? Well, on the one hand, you've got the billionaires and the benefactors that are maybe able to shower you with money and plaster your face all over the place. You've also got the sort of traveling companions that we see in like the intellectual dark web, or in the case of Joe Rogan, one of my favorite responses when people cried out, Pace, against your labeling of Rogan as a right winger, when you pointed out that he's never met sort of a neo-fascist he hasn't liked or at least platformed.
He's not even retroactively disavowed these people.
Right. And so, but that's just it, right? The people who provide the platforms for these conversations, the people who view themselves as network super connectors working hard behind the scene to make sure we have the global consciousness elevation by bringing us all together. Well, we stumbled across a secret password protected website that was put together by some people who were looking to sort of arrange psychedelic spaces in this thought leadery way. And, they were looking to create a retreat for 100 psychedelic leaders, so-called. They were supposedly going to have a diverse local community gathering where, what does it say? Sorry about that. I lost the page.
This makes for great listening material.
It says,
yeah, we just need some bossa nova cut in here.
It says specifically, the global psychedelic movement will follow the lead of our community. So it's like we're at this moment where all this psychedelic renaissance is happening, and we are the epicenter of this, and we will decide where we go from here. And then we need to like specifically and explicitly steer the ship to determine, this invite only group of thought leaders to determine the future direction of psychedelics in society.
It's that well-known community vanguard that has...
Right. We are inviting leaders in the psychedelic community, working locally, where they are. The thing is, who determines who those leaders are, right? When you go to the About page and you see that there's 2 folks who have set this up, like, sure, there's a bunch of other organizations that have signed on to this, that have their names attached to it in one form or another. But again, who gets to be in the room in the first place? Who gets to then determine...
name these organizations?
I think at this point, out of, shall we call it respect or a desire to minimize drama for the moment,
it's more about the point.
Let's talk about the dynamics, right?
Sounds
I
good.
mean, we name names plenty of times. I think we can show a little discretion
no
here.
one will accuse us of not doing that.
Right. Well, let's say in this moment we are explicitly calling in rather than calling out, right? If this comes to people's attention, we would ask them to check their motivations and consider some of the critiques that we're trying to put out here. I think citing the website is more to say this is really happening. These are real concerns based in real actions that we're seeing. We would like to correct these actions, not make the actors feel shame or embarrassment around what they're doing.
I mean, that's generally where we're at, I would say. I don't know. I think that people take some of our tactics, a little bit harshly, but I mean, that's one of the things that Anand talks about in his book, Winners Take All, is that, if you name names, you may be doing something where you're pursuing a strategy where you're talking about picking fights with people who one day you might find useful. And this is what is going to make you conflict adverse. It's going to make you not name perpetrators. And when we say perpetrators, we mean people who are actively doing harm. And so, your star will rise if you center and focus on victims, but never name a perpetrator. And, we've done that.
If you want, sorry, I was just going to say, if you want to name names, I mean, just real quick on that front, I think around this particular event and the people organizing it, again, we could reach out to them privately, personally, say, hey, what's up with this? I think in this case, it's less about like just correcting it behind the scenes and making it go away and not having folks recognize that this is an issue. I think talking about it in this way allows us to bring it up, highlight it as an issue, and perhaps create some room for discussion that can happen in a more public way. But if we want to name names, there have been organizations like North Star that have explicitly said they can't and won't grow teeth, that they can't name perpetrators, that they can't name bad actors, and they've said that publicly. So I think that's fair game to discuss.
And this field has always had higher ups, conference organizers, for as long as that, for the decade that I've been in the field, who are not all of them, but a good number of outright narcissistic abusers who are very happy to go behind people's backs and talk poorly of those of us who are trying to call attention to their tactics, their abuses of power, etc. And so we end up with a situation where suddenly the people who are speaking out, trying to address these abuses, are cast as the problem. We're the losers, we're the black sheep because of those dynamics behind the scenes. So
what they do behind the scenes is they recuperate a lot of our analysis and
right
as their own. What they do is they take a little bit of sandpaper, get rid of that edge there, put a little coat of paint on it.
Yeah. They make sure, first of all, that we're not invited, right, to the conferences. They make sure to say that we're problematic, that we're bullies, that we're doing, all these wrong things. And then once we're conveniently out of the way, that's when they take the ideas and sandpaper them and offer them as their own.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that end, we had a really interesting interaction that, again, I think we'll keep nameless for this discussion. But after Nishay published the video dealing with the psychedelic arm of the intellectual dark web, we wound up in conversation with folks who were sort of, let's say, somehow affiliated with the Critique. And we had some email exchanges. And in the course of that email exchange, so somebody whose work had been sent to me by, I guess, a mutual contact, we can call them, who said, hey, Dave, check this stuff out. It seems like it's a bit derivative of some of the critiques you've been offering lately, both around Compass and your older critiques of MDMA for PTSD in the case of like drone operators specifically, but military more broadly. And sure enough, I watched a video and I was like, oh, wow, that really does sound quite similar to things I've offered. And then we wound up in an email chain with this individual because they were looking for, they wanted contact information for someone from us. And we asked that they engage with some questions that we'd put forth publicly and hadn't heard back on. And in following up, all of a sudden I'm being told that the underlying material for, we will call it Pala, the comic that Dave over at North Star had put out, suddenly this person is taking credit for the underlying intellectual material below that, like undergirding that, the conceptual framework, if you will. And,
saying it inspired that. And that basically is the touchstone in a lot of conferences and talks for addressing any of these systemic issues. It's always citing back to that story.
We will call it Pala, which, if you just search that, you'll find it.
Yeah, and the funny thing about suddenly having this person tell me that their intellectual work was the touchstone for Pala was that I'd been in conversation with the artist behind Pala. We had met at the 2018 CIIS conference on psychedelics, cultural and political perspectives. And I know for a fact that the analysis and the points presented in that comic came from a panel that I was on with Jeff Bathji and Bob Jesse and Rick Doblin, a number of the concerns I had raised about data mining and surveillance capitalism, as well as the way that businesses scale within capitalism, and that we see vertical integration and the like. You know, all of those critiques made it into the comic, as well as, and Dave had told me, you know, grappling with some of the sensations he got from looking out across the room at this event as they were grappling with all of these different perspectives coming out of this panel. So to then have this person telling me that, oh, no, you know, my ideas from a year later from this talk I gave were what really undergirded Pala, it was this really surreal moment of somebody who I think we had all identified as that sort of thought leadery, cozy with power, acritical, ahistorical type, but to then suddenly be confronted with those words. And when we followed up with further questions and comments, you know, the response we got was something to the effect of, you vastly overestimate how much of a fuck I give. And I don't know about y'all, but to me, it's sort of like wherever we're coming from, like this side or this perspective, these critiques, like, you know, giving a fuck is kind of the point. Like, we're here because we give a fuck. So it was, like, again, like in
two fucks
or three. My field of fucks is certainly not as barren as some. But I think pointing out that the way that those critiques get sort of recuperated and developed and deployed and turned into a commodity, right? They become sold. They defang.
Productized.
Yeah.
Well, I think what they do is they pad somebody's resume as to how much they care. Because as somebody who used to work in PR, I can tell you, people don't really care what you have to say until they know how much you care. And, you know, you have to articulate a problem, you know, and you have to associate yourself with, you know, with some awareness of how complex things are before you just run in there with your easy solution, because that's the game. And that often looks like taking information that was put together by more public intellectual types, people who aren't you know, trying to pander to the powerful and pamper them. And then as we've said earlier, you know, sandpapering off some of those edges to make them more palatable. This dovetails really nicely with the mainstreaming that we've been talking about for a long time.
So for instance, here's a non-thought leader idea, is that psychedelics aren't going to save the world from its mental health issues, but actually addressing public policy and say perhaps a universal basic income, say perhaps Joe Biden forgiving $50,000 of student debt, perhaps Medicare for all. Like, that actually will address mental health an unbelievable amount more than your $15,000 MDMA, you know, that setup. That is not a thought leader idea. A thought leader idea is psychedelics for mental health. Like, go to your local clinic, you know, don't worry about all those other things. And in fact, don't even talk about them.
For people like Jamie Wheel, scaling access to ecstatic states of consciousness, like that is the approach, rather than
that I mean, that sounds like something that a Spanish missionary in 1575 would help someone in Peru,
as if they aren't already at our fingertips, as if they don't literally exist within ourselves.
I just wanted to read a little thing here that Anand says in the book, kind of illustrating what I just said. He says, take, for example, the question of educating poor children in a time of declining social mobility. A true critic might call for an end to funding schools by local property taxes and the creation, as in many advanced countries, of a common national pool that funds schools more or less equally. What a thought leader might offer Market World and its winners is a kind of intellectual counteroffer. The idea, say, of using big data to better compensate star teachers and weed out bad ones. And I think that's very much kind of where the discourse is in this space. The fact that it is controversial to say that it's probably better to address address healthcare. You know, I actually see very few people in psychedelic spaces like talking about Medicare for all or something like that.
It's incredible.
I actually don't hear it. I think so. Just to make kind of a little distinction here for listeners, I think there's generally the psychedelic space is sort of separate from the overall like drug policy reform space, which the drug policy reform space more say overlaps with harm reduction than in the psychedelic world. A lot of the drug policy kind of folks, psychedelics are kind of fucking weird still. So there's just sort of that overlap. But I actually really don't hear anyone in psychedelia talking about universal basic income or Medicare for all. Which if you want to be honest about it and you want to actually and you care about mental health or any of these things or alleviating suffering, if you want to alleviate suffering, I think making psychedelics accessible is probably one of the dumbest things that I've ever actually heard. However, giving people some money so they can get by and reduce, you know, it's like there's a reason right now that that suicides are skyrocketing with women in Japan right now, and it's not because of the lack of psychedelics. You know, I was just listening to something on that. It's because of financial anxiety that people are homelessness and basically game over. It's like when you're playing a video game, it's game over. You lose your money, it's game over. You take your life. You know, and in the case of say MDMA for PTSD, I never ever hear that if we want to stop soldiers from getting PTSD, perhaps they shouldn't go into legal wars. We don't hear that. You know, what we do is we focus on the individual. We take the soldier who saw his friend's face get blown off out in Fallujah or something, and we then take him, we center him, we take the individual there, and we tell his story, hoping that his story is going to resonate and sort of make that, you know, that incremental, that slow incremental change.
Well, and don't ask why he's there in the first place, right? Don't ask,
right.
Don't examine any of the broader. Right. Sorry, go ahead,
right.
Pace.
And I think those kind of two sides there really represent the critic versus the thought leader.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
The thought leader is specifically proposing quick fixes that are going to be palatable to the people who are in positions of power, who are then going to privatize that solution, whatever that solution that they're offering is. Whereas the critics, when you think critics, think Chomsky, think Cornel West, like, you know,
who want to change the structure of society.
Yeah.
And then you have, you know, the sort of counter revolutionaries like you know, Jordan Peterson, who say, you know, clean your room before you think about, you know, changing society. And yet you look around society, there's plenty to change. Okay. Like neoliberalism is going to kill every last man, woman, and child on this planet.
But it's so invisible to so many people. Like that's invisible. They don't know about that.
But I mean, you know, you were talking about Japan. You know, Nishay and I are in Ohio, right here in Appalachia. Like, or I mean, not right here, but like we're adjacent to West Virginia, Appalachia, and Southern Ohio is close to it. This is the epicenter of the opioid addiction. Opioid epidemic, and despair deaths is something that is absolutely like related to a bleak economic outlook, and we're talking about everything from these overdoses to you know, death by cirrhosis and suicide, and it's so significant in some demographics that it has literally lowered the life expectancy for Americans in recent years. Like, so to ignore, you know, systemic issues and to pretend like, you know, there's a silver bullet like psychedelics. Look, I like psychedelics. We all like psychedelics, but to pretend like that is alone the answer, and that moreover we need capital to bring it to bear. Well, it's macabre
to pretend that 18MC is 18MC, right?
That's one of them. Now
Yeah,
it's
to propose-
Tabernanthalog. There's a new
okay.
one.
Well, regardless, to pretend
Tabernanthalog.
that
Oh,
is
God.
going to solve the opioid, the overdose crisis is batshit, and that's even batshit to any savvy investor. You know, it's like that's seen as ridiculous.
Well, except maybe a pump and dumper who recognizes you can ride the wave.
Absolutely.
Oh, wait, people lie? Huh.
Well, so something to throw out, you know, as we're talking about, let's say, issues closer to home, you know, if we consider, for example, and taking it back to this notion of like elite benefactors and trickle down, whether it's philanthropy or consciousness or whatever, you know, we've talked a bit about, or at least personally, sort of off the air, about what's gone down in Flint, Michigan, right? And every now and again, you'll see the meme gain traction again, that like, you know, the fact that no billionaire has stepped in and single-handedly funded Flint's water relief efforts is all the indication you need to recognize that philanthrocapitalism is not going to.
Here's a good thought leader idea. Like, fuck the fact that like this lead in drinking water and everything like that in Flint. I have a proposal here that we have water filters, and if you buy a water filter, one automatically gets donated to a family in Flint. You know, so you're doing good. You're doing well by doing good there. You know,
all right,
don't worry about the public infrastructure there. Don't even talk about it. Just do your part.
Well,
is this the Tom's method of solving the Flint water crisis?
And this is the one that I've been.
What if we
about
just put money
lately.
towards like a big infrastructure project that actually like fixed the thing that they broke? They broke it on purpose.
Shut the fuck up.
Yeah, that's absolutely communism. And it's worth pointing out, right, that Tim Ferriss and the guy behind Tom's, like these folks are involved in the Baltimore, the new Johns Hopkins, right, psychedelic center. They were funders for that center, as memory serves, and we
We're just trying to capture that value.
Well.
Right. Well, and so the other thing is, like, for a while I worked as a virtual executive assistant, and like I worked for one of the clients. That's gonna
actually shock people to hear.
I'm sure. I remember when I met Dimitri Mugyanis, and he asked what I did after giving a talk on like systemic realities of capitalism and imagining a post-prohibition world at the Symposia event in 2015. He said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Meaningless bullshit." And he was like, "No, really, what do you do?" And I was like, "No, meaningless bullshit," and explained some of the stuff. But at the time, one of the clients I had was developing a sustainable water filter. Right. And the notion was, instead of using one of those, you know, proper Britas or whatever that has the actual ability to filter out a whole bunch of shit, we'll do one with like a carbon based filter that it'll filter out a lot less, but you know, it comes from, you know, these natural fibers, and don't ask any questions about the plastics used in it, and don't ask about the glass, and don't ask about how it's manufactured and distributed around the world. Just recognize that it's sustainable, and you buy it and you feel better. But when I was working there, I was on communications. I was on emails, actually at one point with Tim Ferriss, at another point with Sherman Peshawar, who's brought up, he was involved in funding Uber and Airbnb and investing early in those companies and making a ton of money. But in that group of people, the way that they would play some of these sort of social clout games, or like seeing an email that went back and forth with a footer about how this guy had helped a homeless person because he gave him a couple bucks, and what a great guy that made him out to be. And the fact that like people were passing this around as though it was some like noble story, right? But that's just it. Like the way that this shit, you know, they turn these little life events, these, whether they're actually personally significant to them or not, I can't comment, but they pass these little like vignettes around as though they're meaningful and accrue these ungodly sums of money while these huge, you know, humanitarian crises rage on. And the disconnect is kind of jaw-dropping. And you see that all of the incentives as far as how they're rewarded for playing those games, the sort of social circles that they travel in, the ability to pat themselves on the back to come together at South by Southwest or whatever sort of tastemaker festival and celebrate each other's philanthropic accomplishments. I mean, the whole thing seems like clearly a racket.
Because it is.
Well, and so then to bring it back to psychedelics, right, and to talk about some of the silly narratives that get sold, I just stumbled across the chief scientific and medical officer of a company called Small Pharma that I think is located in the UK, but is about to go public, I think, on the Canadian Stock Exchange, where talking about DMT, she said, the psychedelic drug breaks up all of the ruminative thought processes in your brain. It literally undoes what has been done by either the stress you've been through or the depressive thoughts you have. And to me, like, as these narratives of change and medical psychedelics get propagated by these people, like, it's not just that thought leaders have intellectually deficient ideas. It's that some of these narratives around psychedelics have real potentials for harm. And looking at this and statements like this, or seeing Ben Sessa recently slapping two graphs together from two studies. Go ahead, Pace, you want to say something?
Let's just say that that's not fucking all that DMT does. It doesn't just break up the ruminative, like, it can do a lot of things, and that's
a lot of
not
really
the
fucked
only
up things too.
Yeah, like
it can throw you into some very dark places. And it does with like a certain regularity. If you just like ask 1,000 people who've taken DMT, you're going to have a certain percentage who went someplace pretty not so good.
Well, so this is part of what I'm trying to get to. I'm pointing to Ben Sessa's recent, sticking these two charts together that had nothing to do with each other in an effect to make it look like MDMA is wildly effective in ways that it may not be. Who knows, right? The science is not there. The narratives that get sold and the way that patient expectations are potentially mismanaged, right? That you get this inflation of, oh, all of these things are going to do it. And actually, this fits into what I've been hearing all of these pundits say, that psychedelics have the opportunity to disrupt all of my thought patterns. So maybe if I smoke DMT, it'll actually really help me with my depression. Maybe. Or maybe it will, interact with it in ways where now you're dealing with a true existential crisis on top of whatever angst, anxiety, depression you were already dealing with. Maybe you get thrown for an ontological loop that leaves you wondering what the fuck existence even means, and how do you find or make meaning out of it? How do you put the pieces of your life back together? I mean, having seen people attempt to grapple with some of the fallout and direct effects of psychedelic experiences, some of these acritical narratives that are getting woven into this thought leadery fabric are concerning in that they may present real world harms and potentially in, rather vulnerable populations.
Well, that's just a challenging experience, and it's good for you.
Well,
yeah, the thing that the thought leader doesn't tell you is that, like, this is like the philosopher's stone of capitalist, like, maintenance therapies. They're not gonna tell you that. That's not gonna be the thing that they
why not?
Well, it's actually, I think it's the thing that very few people are even thinking about, like the acquisition of soma. That's, I think, really where we're headed with this. If people disagree, I'd love to hear how it's not.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about, like, all this mainstreaming of psychedelics, the narrative surrounding it, they really appear to be like the acquisition of soma. As an ultimate.
I mean, what do you mean by that, though?
I mean, as like an ultimate maintainer of the status quo where we're at right now.
Like, as in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, soma, life got you down, go take a soma holiday kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and Huxley is the ultimate I think, thought leader in proposing anything like that.
Huxley talked about torture and a number of things that governments
do. The
do.
ultimate win-losey thing to talk about.
Nishay, was there something you wanted to elaborate on?
Oh, no, I was just.
I mean, I'm happy. Sure. You seemed dissatisfied with some of Normie's response. not to put Normie on the spot, but just to
Look,
pull
what I
pull the
was
thread a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about this notion again. We're back to that zoom in versus zoom out. Right. We're back to the notion that psychedelics being used in such a way, not to say, like, let's say you go out into nature and you have an experience that shows you that the interconnection of all things is vitally important to continued existence on Earth. Right. So that you can make meaning of that in a way where suddenly you're faced with, oh shit, what do we do about these larger structures that are challenging, let's say, ecological integrity across the planet, and recognizing a need to link up with other people, Extinction Rebellion, deep ecological movements, Earth First, whomever, right? Or you could have a more, and sorry for the caricaturing, hippy dippy, I'm gonna just hug this tree and everything is all at one. And anytime that I feel anxiety around the ecological crisis, I'm gonna try to just come out here and take a dose of whatever and meditate in direct communication with this tree. I'll smoke this changa and watch my bush.
I'll just self-optimize a little bit.
Yeah. But I think, again, we're talking about like a choice in how that's seen. We're talking about a choice in how people orient not only their psychological or their psychedelic use, but also like the critiques and the engagement with society in the wake of that and around that, and the broader discourse, let's say, of this space. I mean, the broader discourse of society as well, but we're in this little niche.
Well, and psychedelics can be used to kind of decondition you from accepting predator narratives that justify and perpetuate predation, like what we were chatting with Lily about as diddler ideologies, because it's like you're fed all of these hegemonic ideas about like, oh, little mouse, just like come climb over into this, open hallway where I can just pounce on you. And the mouse is like, yeah, let's do it. But like, it allows you to step back from some of those narratives and be like, whoa, this is really messed up. These dynamics are very non-consensual, lots of boots here being stepped on, not cool with this. But only if they're used that way, as a kind of intentional way of deconditioning from those, elite mythologies that perpetuate the status quo, and instead reconnecting in coalitions, movement building, solidarity with others to create a different potential future. That is there as an option. But if we're hyper focused on these optimized, individualistic, self-help approaches to rolling with the waves of the status quo, that potential use is not going to be embraced. So that's kind of the stakes here a bit, is that like when because of the importance of set and setting, if we're doing this, thought leader game and patting ourselves on the back for how we've made it to, this private camp at Burning Man, and, there's Elon Musk in the corner and hooray, we've done it, then we're not doing these other things. So that's kind of like what I wanted to just bring it back to.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I guess what I was saying is like, I'm more discussing about the current discourse, and where things appear to be headed, where capital appears to be pooling right now. It seems to be more the same.
I want to talk about like the appropriative language of like liberatory narratives that it seems really common, particularly in the thought leader space, but super all over the place in the psychedelic discourse generally. Just borrowing from sort of social justice, like, for lack of a better term, like a brave new world, like another world is possible. Okay. That language from the anti-globalization movement, another world is possible. It can be reinterpreted in a lot of ways. And it doesn't always mean that other world that is possible is a better one. And so I mean, I would like to imagine a better one. I think the people who adopted that, maxim definitely did, but we can't get away from the fact that there are a lot of these sort of elites that are using psychedelics, and they are not, coming to the conclusion that that the the golden toilets that they sit on, were built
Well,
by human suffering, and that's wrong, and that they need to change their lives so those systems can be torn down. Like, that's not what's happening.
so the chapter that we're discussing starts out with a quote from Upton Sinclair.
Yes.
That says, "It is
Yeah.
difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it."
Absolutely. I mean, I was really glad that was included, because it's something that, I've noted.
I mean, you'd be a
It's a
real
good quote.
terrible
It's a good quote.
spokesperson for one of these companies if you went around like talking about like everything we're talking about,
Sure, but and I think that
actually
actually
would
both
be
of those,
fired.
both the Upton Sinclair quote and the degree to which such systemic critiques would make one a bad spokesperson for a corporadelic outfit underscore something that Niché has referred to around like the importance of demythologizing elite narratives, right? And the fact that being willing and able to say the emperor wears no clothes,
Right.
like the evidence is here. I mean, one of the benefits of taking the sort of the approach, like advancing a critique that has explanatory value, right? Advancing a critique where we can say, no, look, like the things we're saying actually match what we're seeing in the world and what we expect to see. And if we're wrong about it, you can point out where we're wrong and why, and we can either correct and adjust for it, or we can discuss why it went astray there. And then we can make more predictions about what's coming. And hopefully, like, the point of this is not just to predict and say, ooh, we were right. The point is to predict so that we can head it off. Like, one of the points I made recently about, somebody was pointing out that Peter Thiel just put $125 million into a tie, and, all these other things going on. And I pointed out that, like, had Rick been willing to take, Rick Doblin, Maps, been willing to take some of the critiques and concerns about Peter Thiel seriously years ago, right? Had he been willing to consider some of the critiques about capitalism and the systemic nature of, and the structural incentives of corporations and how this system functions, right? Maybe he wouldn't have caricatured the concerns around these actors and these business structures, and instead of inviting Compass in and giving George and Katya sort of the keys to the kingdom, if you will, or at least like introductions and the red carpet to the psychedelic network of researchers, perhaps we wouldn't be in the position that we are. Now, regardless, we're in this position. So now let's use sort of the critique and the analysis to figure out where else we can leverage interference or deconstruction of the systems that we're seeing.
One interesting thing that we did an interview with a patient privacy, and we'll probably discuss more of this in the future. But we had a conversation with people who work in a patient privacy advocacy organization, and we ran some of our current analyses by them, and they were just like, yeah, like, there was no surprise. Like, yeah, of course, this is how this works. But you bring that up to people in psychedelic institutions. It's like, oh, you're a conspiracy theory, buddy. Like, this wearables. I don't know about connecting wearables to psychedelics. Like, what's that? Ugh.
Or you get the head of you get the head of psychedelic data firms saying, we're not doing surveillance capitalism. And then you show them, I did this on Twitter with MindLeap Health, where the CEO said, oh, we're not engaged in surveillance capitalism. We oppose that. And then I pulled from their terms of service where they talk about behavioral targeting, right? And predictive ad sales and the like. And the response is, oh, well, it's 2020. That's how business gets done. And I just pointed out
the gotcha journalism, Dave? Like, why are you bullying CEOs? Why are you cyber bullying CEOs? It's just not nice.
Guess I have this vindictive streak.
And you know what? I learned in business school that if I'm not doing something that I don't want somebody else to say that I'm doing, I just make up another word for what it is that I'm doing. So,
ooh,
gotcha.
Fancy.
Big data.
But it just seems, again, looking at the gulf that exists between the stated actions and what's actually going on, Nishay, you wanted to say something.
No, I just was messaging that we should probably
We should wrap.
soon, 'cause-
Dave and
No,
I
I
would
didn't
go
mean
off
to-
on this topic, but I think it's a topic that you're going to see the thought leaders like capitalize on. That, you know, psychedelics, wearables. That's how you're going to improve the individual. You know, what they don't talk about is the
Nutraceuticals
amount
too.
of- yeah, what they're not going to talk about is the amount of data that is being sucked from you, and the profits that are going to come from that. You're only going to see the nice sheen on the outside.
Most business
your
strategies
health.
function based on an information asymmetry.
Sure. Look,
These
there's
days.
going to be
They require it.
in the future. You're going to have your Netflix specials. You're going to have, you know, your whatever. You have it in yoga. You have it in you had it with the social. What is it? The Social Dilemma. Is that the name of it on Netflix?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're gonna have that in with psychedelics.
What's it going to be called? We called the psychedelic flub. Nope. No, that's not going to work. All right.
Well, I know we got to wrap.
Why don't we
I
talk
just
about
wanted-
some of this to the Patreon folks at the end?
We will. I just, as one final point to the general listenership, because Nishay and I were talking about this before we hopped on, and I just want to say it explicitly to sort of maybe put a little bit of a bow on the conversation, just to point out that psychedelics can be uniquely helpful tools for drawing awareness to the systems that we're talking about. But ultimately, we need action, and the action that we're talking about is fundamentally antithetical to the orientation of thought leaders and the power that they serve. And it really is just that simple.
Sweet. See you